Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. Well, today I have a question for you. Who are Linux desktop users? Because there's certainly a minority, less than 3% of all computer users out there. Well, today we're going to have a gentle ramble through some of the possible answers. Join me after the intro. Okay, welcome back, and welcome to another OTB Ramble. It's quite a few weeks since I've done one of these, so I thought it was high time I released one. Now, for those of you who have listened to my rambles before, you'll know that I often hang them on a key subject area, and today it's going to be who are Linux desktop users, but I cover a whole range of different things throughout the ramble, and I know that my style doesn't appeal to everybody. In fact, it would often challenge even the most robust of attention spans. Some of you like it, some of you don't. But for those who just want to jump to the relevant bits, I shall put a thing up here that gives you the timings of when I'm covering different subjects. So, with that said, let's get to the question of Linux desktop users. Now, here I'm not talking about the army of people out there who use Android phones or Chromebooks. I'm talking about who are people who actually use a proper Linux distro on their desktop or laptop. It's a really complex subject, and given all the talk of, Linux trying to increase its market share, they need to understand who they're actually appealing to. And just for a little bit of fun, and it is only a little bit of fun, I thought that what I would try and do is put together a typology of different Linux users. Now, before I do that, I think I need to put in some caveats. I like typologies, but they are always open to criticism that you're just creating stereotypes. And yes, of course, they're stereotypes, but stereotypes often get a bad press through misunderstanding. What they actually are is categories that contain elements of truth, but they don't necessarily represent any actual individual. In fact, categories are things that individuals can belong to and may belong to more than one. And back in the day, I've got a fairly varied career. I worked as a researcher in academia, and looking at fairly complex subjects, the key to doing research is to distill the complex subjects down into a set of understandable themes or concepts. And I've been playing around with this in my mind for, some months really. I don't pretend it's complete. I don't pretend that any actual person fits one of these categories completely. But it's a bit of fun. It's playful. See what you think. Right, so let's start. If, like me, you find computers really interesting and Linux really interesting, it's all too easy to understand that not everybody feels like that. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that over 90% of the population don't feel like that. Most people use a computer because it does what they want it to do. They have no interest in the operating system whatsoever. They buy a computer, they use whatever came on it. This is your average Windows user. They might have a preference for, say, Macs because they've been told they're good, or they use them at work. But for the most part, at home, they'll use whatever happens to be on their computer at the time. I would suggest that many of these users will not fit into the power user category of computer users, but they may do in their work. But at home, they use a computer for, I would suggest, fairly basic things. Email, web browsing. Perhaps they're a gamer, but I think in this category quite unlikely, because we're talking about people who, I was going to describe these people as the technologically disinclined or disinterested, but I realised that actually that wouldn't be a good description, because many of these people are highly technical in their jobs and what they do outside in the real world. But computers just aren't the thing for them. It doesn't float their boat. Now, there's lots of talk about, year of the Linux desktop. I don't think it's going to happen. But if it ever did happen, this is the category of people, the largest category of people that Linux has to break into. And it's difficult because computers don't really float the boat of these people. That's not to say that we haven't got some Linux users who fall into this unintentional category. In fact, I would call them unintentional users. And that's because they didn't make the explicit decision to download a Linux distro and install it on their machine. It's almost a happy accident. They may have bought a computer or a laptop that's pre-installed with Linux and they just use it. Quite unlikely that in the UK we haven't got many places that will supply you with pre-installed Linux machines at a cheap cost. And I would say cost is probably one of the overriding things here for these unintentional users. I think more likely they may have bought themselves a cheap laptop on the likes of eBay and it came perhaps pre-installed with Linux. Or more likely, they could be the family and friends of other Linux users who have installed the system on their computers. Now, I think I'd put my wife into this category. I've installed Linux onto my wife's laptop, and she uses it. She uses Facebook. She opens up a web browser and does a Google search. She does a bit of email. That's about it. Is she even aware that she's using Linux as opposed to Windows? I'd go as far as to say that most of the time, probably not. Because it's not a thing for her. As long as she can do what she wants to do with her laptop or computer, she's happy. And I wonder just how many people out there, these unintentional users, are unintentional users simply because somebody else has put Linux on their computer for them. I think it's quite a small category, this, compared to some others, but nevertheless, it's got the most potential. It's the largest category out there. And I think that the only way that Linux will ever capture that market is to come pre-installed on computers. You can usually spot the unintentional user by their reaction when you chat to them about Linux. You will sometimes see a glazing over of the eyes, or perhaps even a rolling of eyes. I know I see this every day. As soon as I put on a YouTube video that's discussing Linux, I only have to look out the side of my eye at my wife and watch her going, oh, God, here we go again. So, our first category, the unintentional user. Small, but great potential. Until we capture this category, we are never going to get a bigger market share. The next category I call Linux tourists. And the thing that separates Linux tourists from the unintentional user is, one, they tend to be more technologically inclined. They have more of an interest in such things as operating systems. And they have a spirit of adventure as well. it interests them. They want to explore different options. Now, some of these Linux tourists may well have moved over from being an unintentional user because it triggered their interest. But one of the things that I would say about all tourists is home is always home. And home in this sense would be wherever they've come from. So they may have come from Windows, they may have come from Mac, and the chances are they won't completely relinquish Windows or Mac. They will probably dual boot or use Linux on a different computer, and they will use Linux perhaps for some tasks or just exploring, but they will go back to their previous operating system as needs be. Obviously, our accidental user doesn't necessarily fall into that category because they have no home to go back to, if you like, but they do share one of the other characteristics, I think, of the tourist. The Linux tourist will never settle on a particular distro. They become the distro hoppers, constantly searching for the magic bullet that does everything for them that they want. Now, I think we can start to subdivide our Linux tourists into different subcategories as well. So you have our accidental tourists who have moved over from being an unintentional user to someone who actually has an interest in the system. We then have what I call the critical tourist. And the critical tourist is coming over to us because they want to see if Linux is better than the operating system that they've been used to. They're often identifiable by the questions they ask on forums and the like. And it's normally, how do I get this Adobe, Microsoft, other Windows or Apple Mac application running on Linux? And they can be very critical at times that Linux isn't Windows or Mac, so is in no way designed to run these apps, and there is often a lack of appreciation that the fact that we can get many of these things running at all is amazing in itself. But the critical tourist will always compare Linux to their home, where they've come from, and where they will often go back to. And you'll see comments all the time saying, oh, I tried XYZ distro several years ago and I couldn't get it configured, or I couldn't get this working, so I went back to Windows. I have a try every 6 months or so, but Linux really isn't there yet. So the critical tourist, I think, tends to evaluate how good Linux is using criteria based on what they can do on their other operating systems. We then have those who probably still dual boot, probably use a mixture of operating systems, but are actually quite impressed with what Linux can do. And they will spend a fair degree of their time away from their home, their Windows or their Mac computer. I would call these expats. Like expats, they haven't got full citizenship yet of Linux. They travel back and forward, but they really like it. They really like the environment, and they come for a holiday as often as possible, or come and spend 6 months of the year with us. So we've got this tourist category. We've got your unexpected tourist, or rather your accidental tourist. You've got your critical tourist, and you've got your expat. I think that as the situation is at the moment, most Linux users could associate themselves with being a Linux tourist in some way. I think this probably describes the mass majority of users that we have. Certainly, many of us are distro hoppers, and we swap and change to suit. Yes, we may stabilize on a particular platform or distro, But there comes a time when we need to move on. And we probably use other operating systems as well. So I have elements in myself that I would describe as a tourist. I would certainly put myself as an expat. But yeah, for work, I have to use Windows. And I have a MacBook downstairs, which is my TV computer. It just sits there and I pick it up if I want to do a quick web search. I've had it for years. It's 2013 MacBook Air. It's fine. So, but Linux is my passion. So I distro hop. I would say Linux is probably my home yet. But have I got full citizenship? Am I 100% Linux and never anything else? No. And I think most of us fall in this category. Now, it may well be that after becoming an expat, a user gravitates to a particular distro and becomes what I would call a loyalist. Loyalists are your fanboys. Loyalists are Linux users who have found a distro that just works for them and it can do no wrong. They see no point trying anything else. Their distro hopping days are done, and it doesn't seem to matter about the strengths and weaknesses of their distro. As far as they're concerned, it's the best thing since sliced bread. Or at least it is until they become a tourist again. So they may well go through stages of loyalism, being a loyalist, but the loyalty doesn't always last a lifetime. In fact, they may even move up to the next level, because these are hierarchical in a way, because they want to move on. And rather than becoming a tourist, they become what I call an enthusiast. Now, an enthusiast, or the enthusiast category, is what I would most clearly associate myself with. Yes, I've got touches of the tourism in me, but I'm mainly a Linux enthusiast. I've described myself as that many times, as opposed to being a Linux evangelist. And the enthusiast tends to be quite technologically aware. There's lots of different levels of competency. They may or may not be a developer. I'm certainly not. But they quite like digging under the hood on occasion and learning new things. For them, Linux becomes a hobby. They are the hobbyist of the Linux world. And they are the ones that, interestingly enough, most people associate with Linux users. Because they are the ones that fit into the category of geeks. And I would proudly admit that I am a geek. Absolutely. Or at least I'm a geek when I'm working on my computer and talking to you guys out there, not necessarily at work. But the geek tends to extend the hobby side of his or her interest in Linux into other realms of life. So let's give you my example, for instance. They may well set up a YouTube channel out of interest. They probably subscribe to a range of different newsrooms or chat or Linux magazines that they're going to read. Or they may well have lots of different Linux and technical channels on their YouTube subscription. They may chat with other like-minded people. They may become a member of a Linux user group, for instance. And these are probably the people who remain loyal to Linux for the longest period of time. I've done 16 years now. Geeks or enthusiasts do not necessarily associate themselves with one distro, but they could. That's not a factor that would go against being an enthusiast. The thing that marks out the enthusiast is Linux is not just a way of using a computer. Linux is an interest, a hobby, and often a driving passion. Strangely enough, though, although you often get the impression on forums and the like that all Linux users fall into this category, it's actually a tiny percentage of Linux users fall into this category. The fact that we're on forums and news groups and everything else is because we're the people who populate those sort of things. So we're the people that you see. We're the people that you're watching on YouTube, because those who just have a mild interest probably wouldn't push their interest to the extreme of being an all-consuming hobby, which I sort of feel Linux has become, as far as I'm concerned. So we've covered 4 categories so far: the unintentional user, the tourist, the loyalist, the enthusiast, and I've got one more category. You could probably fit many more into this, but the final category I've called the philosophers. The philosophers are differentiated by the fact that they've bought into the philosophy surrounding Linux, free and open source software. For them, all of that is really important. Now, the extent that they've bought into it will depend on each individual. And I believe you can subdivide the philosophers again into different categories, starting with what I would call the pragmatist, who believes that the ideals of the open source and free software world are indeed just that. They are ideals. But they also accept that in the real world, compromises sometimes have to be made, and so they will possibly even swap and change between different operating systems, and they may not be averse to installing a binary blob on their computer to get their NVIDIA card working. They would prefer they didn't have to, but for practical reasons, they accept that the ideal cannot always be followed strictly, or in their view. We then have what I would call the activist. Now, the activist really believes in the principles of free and open source software. They could be a pragmatist, but what marks them out is they've taken it upon themselves to educate or evangelize their beliefs to the wider community, to extol the virtues of, for instance, the Free Software Foundation. And they will take every opportunity to do that. Now, being an evangelist is one thing, but you can still be a pragmatist. But at the extreme end of the philosophers category, I believe we have, well, people who can only be described as extremists. So your extremist is someone who's bought into the philosophy completely, but more than that, they reject pragmatism absolutely. For them, there is only one way to do things, and one way only. Everything else is unacceptable. So I think you could all think of some names of some famous people in the community who would fit the extremist tag. These people will not run any binary blobs on their systems, and their advice to users who want to run machines that run entirely on free software would be make sure that you buy the hardware that free software supports. And if you don't, well, you need to go out and replace it at an extreme level. So how many of these extremists are there? Actually, very few. I'm pleased to say, because in my view, extremism in anything is never good. There is always a level of compromise somewhere else, somewhere along the way. So there may well be categories that you can think of that I've not talked about here. The important thing to remember, though, is that none of these categories are going to describe individuals perfectly. No one is going to fit ideally into a single category. I personally can draw on categories or characteristics of various parts of this typology. I'm a bit of a tourist on occasion. I still do a bit of distro hopping. I wouldn't call myself a loyalist, although I do have a preference for certain distros, but I can be persuaded to move. They're not always the best things in sliced bread for me. I'm certainly an enthusiast. That is a description that fits me pretty perfectly. But am I a philosopher? Perhaps I have an element of the pragmatism in me, but that's probably as far as I can go. So what do you think? Interesting? Whereabouts would you fall within that typology? Don't forget, this is just playful. I'm just thinking out aloud, really, which I enjoy doing, and it's just something that's kept me entertained during these long days of lockdown. I had to come up with all of those caveats at the beginning because, unfortunately, and I see this again and again in my comments, it seems very easy to offend some people. So I'm really concerned that I don't do that. Please see this as a playful attempt, which is not trying to express an absolute truth. It's simply about thinking of some of the categories in which we fall. Right, so I think that's it for who the Linux desktop users are. Right, so I needed a cup of coffee after that. Lovely. So what else do I want to do today? That took longer than I had intended, but as many of you who watch my channel will know, that's not unusual. I wanted to give you a bit of a channel update, guys. So on the 1st of June this year, the channel will have passed its 1-year mark. And this is video number 85. So it's not quite 2 a week, but that's because for most of the period that I've been running the channel, I've been working full time, and I usually work away, as I've said. And I've taken the opportunity when I'm off to do more videos, and that's sort of increased the overall number. So this is video number 85. We may or may not get close to 100 by the time we're clicking over into the 12-month period. I think it's more likely to be in the early 90s, but 100 is now in sight. And looking back on the last year, it's been an interesting year. I feel much more comfortable in front of the camera now, and I worry less about producing the videos. At the beginning, I was so concerned that people wouldn't watch, and then I was really concerned about the trolls, who you get a lot of, and the little things that used to annoy me no longer do. And one of the little things that really used to annoy me was when I pushed a video up to YouTube, and within 30 seconds, literally 30 seconds, I'd have a thumbs down. Used to drive me crazy, that. I have no problem with people disagreeing with me, no problem at all, but to give me a thumbs down after 30 seconds, when, as you guys know, most of my videos are over half an hour, I know for a fact that that person hasn't even watched it. They have evaluated me based on the title, whatever the title was. Honestly, life's too short. I really don't worry about that these days. I don't expect to appeal to everyone, and I know that I don't. My style is not particularly modern. Somebody mentioned something in the comments on the last video and said, you don't want to be doing that introduction anymore. It's very 1990s. And I thought, 1990s? Wow, I'm not that modern. I struggle to understand some of the critical comments about what I should be doing, because what I should be doing is enjoying myself while I'm making these videos. That's the reason that I do them. And what I tend to do is I use these videos as a sounding board. So I'm not trying to make a quick to the point video which covers 10 salient points. I'm doing an exploration. And in fact, the whole reason behind my channel is when I'm doing things, I film it and I take the viewers along with me. Now, one of the downsides of that is I tend to be a bit rambly. That's not going to change, guys. I've asked a few times, would you rather me make it a bit snappy and more coherent? And for the most part, a lot of you are supportive and you like these channels. This channel, I think, like me, that you put it on the TV or whatever you're doing on your computer, and you're listening to it, and you either settle down with a cup of coffee or whatever, and you like to watch something that isn't just a 5-minute clip. You want to sit down and listen to somebody. They're the sort of videos that I like to watch, and that's what I produce, for good or bad. I have tried to make a few shorter ones, and I always come away thinking, well, that felt like I was just going through the motions, to get another video out there. Can't say I really enjoyed making it. So, yeah. So I'm not going to change my style for you or anyone. If you don't like it, don't watch. Simple as that. Nevertheless, the channel's doing well. 85 videos, just coming up to 1 year. And last night, we hit 7,000 subscribers. I'm pretty stunned at this. The first 4 or 5 months of this year have just been incredible. 7,000 subscribers. That puts 10,000 out there as potential to hit. And for most of the time that I've been running this channel, 10,000 just seemed an extreme amount. But it looks like we're actually going to get there now. So thank you for all your support. And clearly, despite the criticism I get in the comments, many of you out there appreciate the content. And I'm going to follow what I've been doing for the foreseeable future. And in relation to that, it will always be Linux-based. It will always be relevant to Linux. But I will produce videos about different things. I'm never going to go chasing views alone. If I did go chasing views alone, I would just do distro reviews, because they are the videos that get the most views. I mean, I think the Ferren one in recent times is the one that really took off. It's got something like 35,000 views. Wow. I wish I knew the formula, but I don't. I've got no idea why that gains so many views. And other videos I think are really great are still under 2,000. But I think you can get yourself a little bit too het up over views, and I try and ignore it. I try and do a mixture of things. And the key here is I'll produce what I'm interested in together with what I've been asked to do by people in comments on my videos and on the Facebook group I have. And I have a huge list. It's interesting. I thought when I first started this channel, I'm never going to be able to think of a new video every week because I'm going to run out of things to say. But these channels, as I've discovered, become self-sustaining. People ask you to do certain things, and my list gets ever longer. I've got a huge list of things that I could potentially do. And I will only do the ones that I'm interested in. So I'll tell you now, I'm never going to do a Gentoo install. I am never going to do a Funtoo install, and I am never going to do an LFS install. So you can ask all you want. I'm not going to do it. They don't interest me. And if they don't interest me, for me, there's little point in producing a video on it. So it's always a compromise. It's a compromise between requests and also ideas that come into my head that I just find interesting, like this subject I've covered today. So that's where the channel is. We're doing great. Thank you for the continued support, guys. What else do I want to raise? Little bit of YouTube weirdness. If you run a channel, you have no control whatsoever over whether people watch the video or whether you get likes or dislikes. It just happens. You have a degree of control over some of the things when you make a YouTube video, making sure that the content's good, making sure that there's an attractive title, making sure that your keywords or tags are correct, making sure you release the video at the right time. So there are some things that I take into consideration, but ultimately whether or not the video is liked or disliked is out of my hands. Anyway, I put out yesterday's video about Kden Live, which there's a complete example of how my videos sort of self-generate. I went through a process of frustration and I thought, right, I'm going to show you this because I need to find another video editor. So I just did it off the cuff. And I put out that video, and within minutes of it being uploaded, there's 6 thumbs down. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's a record. 6 thumbs down already. Clearly, I'm getting the thumbs down on the title because they can't have watched it yet. And I thought, well, I can't be bothered with that. And I had my tea, and I'll be honest, I fell asleep in front of the TV. And I woke up several hours later, and I had a look at the video to see how it was doing, and it was down to 1 thumbs down. I have never seen a situation where the thumbs downs have just disappeared. And I have absolutely no idea how that happened. In fact, someone made a comment on the video and said, I'm sure when I looked at this earlier, it had about 6 thumbs down. And I must admit, before I read that comment, I was thinking to myself, was I looking at it wrong? I know I was tired. Was I seeing thumbs down where they were actually comments? But no. So I don't know what happened. Excuse me. Was it that people gave me a thumbs down on the title and then watched it and found that it was a bit more balanced and so removed the thumbs down? I think it's forever going to stay a mystery. But needless to say, the YouTube gods were obviously in my corner last night. So whatever happened, hey, thank you. Okay, so I've done the typology. I've done a very rambly channel update. I had a few other things I was going to mention, but it's kind of getting a bit long now, so I'll probably leave them till another video. But one of the things I did want to finish off with, over the course of the months, I've had many people ask if they could see my config file. And I've done a few things when I've been explicitly asked. I've uploaded a couple to my Facebook group. By the way, come and join the OldTechBloke Facebook group. We're nearly at 100 members there, and it's becoming quite active. I can't promise I'll always be there, but there's always someone to speak to. So occasionally I've stuck a configuration file on a Google Drive for download. But I've started to think that, whilst I'm playing around with things such as Spectre WM and BSP WM, people might be actually interested in looking at my configuration files. So this week, I decided that it was time to learn how to sort out a GitLab page. And let me just go to the combined view. And I now have a GitLab page. It's early days. It can be accessed on gitlab.com/OldTechBloke and essentially contains some of my dot files. It's not complete yet. I'm still adding things like readmes and the likes to it, and I'm learning how to use GitLab at the same time. It was a completely alien thing to me, but luckily, a bit of Google foo and a bit of YouTubing, I found out how to create a bare GitLab repo, which was the thing. One of the things that you'll find in here, apart from my bash RC and my X resources file, which has the Nord color scheme on, I think the thing that most people might be interested in looking at is my Alacrity config, which has the color a couple of color themes added to it. Currently, it's got Nord, and it's also got Grovebox, and you can change it over by just changing one word. My BSP WM and SXH KD configs are there. So if anybody wants to have a look at how I've done them, by all means, pull them down. I've also got Polybar there, my Rofi config, my Spectrum or Spectre WM config, and even my Mutt config for using Mutt email. That obviously, I couldn't upload the actual files that contain details of my email addresses, so I created example ones and I anonymized the information and I put them there just so that you can see the format. As with everything, I don't claim to be the ultimate author of many of these things. Ultimately, what I've done is I've modified stuff that I've found online in other GitLab and GitHub repos. So if you want to access it, do so, guys. I've made it public. It's not complete yet. I'll be adding to it. And as I try different things, especially new window managers, I shall post my configs up here. Wow, I really have gone into the era of being a geek now, haven't I, with my own GitLab page. But anyway, yeah, that's that. So, guys, I think this has gone on long enough. Thanks very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed this. And I'll see you next week. I'm not sure when. We're at that strange time when we're moving from lockdown back into work. And I'm not sure how many days I'm going to be working next week. So it's a bit of a moving target. But have a great weekend. Don't forget to join me on Library.